Okay, welcome back, everyone. We hope you were able to look around the expo area, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to this next panel. As countries commit to decarbonizing their economies, the electric power sector will play a leading role in reducing the emissions of other sectors, such as transportation and industry. This session will focus on the new technologies and services electric companies are introducing to support the electrification of our economies, and consider the opportunities and challenges to full electrification. This panel features Pedro Pizarro of Edison International, Pat O'Doherty of ESB, Heather Ferguson of Ontario Power Generation, and Christian Rinning-Tennyson of Statkraft. The session will be moderated by Barry Perry, former president and CEO of Fortis Inc. Please welcome them all to the stage for our next session of the day, Electrifying Transportation, Industry, and Economies.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to the panel members. I want to thank Vanessa for the introductions. Also thank Lawrence Jones and the EEI team for organizing this global electrification forum. It's a very exciting time for our industry, and the panel members that we have tremendous experience in our sector, and I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation today. We're going to start off with a question sort of that level sets, I think, where each of your jurisdictions are in regards to, I would say, the economy-wide electrification. Really, where are you at this point in time, and what areas are you scaling up to use more electricity, I guess, as we head towards achieving our net zero goals in our various jurisdictions? And maybe I will start with Pat. You're the first person on my screen here. So, Pat, just give us a sense of where Ireland is right now in sort of that economy-wide electrification, and how are you going to make improvements over the next number of years?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we're at reasonably early stage in electrification, in economy-wide electrification. The debate and actions are really about, I suppose, getting the fundamental pieces right. So we have a government climate action plan with very, very strong ambitions for 2030. So 70% of electricity generated from renewables by 2030, significant uptake in electric vehicles and electrification of heat. Putting in place, I suppose, the institutional arrangements to make that happen. In terms of my company, I'm a vertically integrated electricity company. So we've got a distribution business, generation business, we've got a retail business. So where we big investment in the electricity distribution system, particularly the DSOs in Ireland, the DSOs of Europe are going to be key enablers of electrification of heat and transportation. So big investment needed in reimagining and transforming the distribution network. Radical changes needed to distribution networks, digitalization of the distribution network, smart metering, smart networks, reconfiguration of tariffs, use of system charging, all to enable electrification. On the retail side, doing a lot of work with customers and understanding the drivers and the needs of customers. I think one of the things utilities have to do is to get better at that. We talk a lot about customer centricity, but really we've a big improvement to make here. And it's about traveling a journey with customers, not bringing customers with us. We have as much a journey to go with them as they have to go with us. So, for example, in ESB, we're doing a lot of work with industrial customers, and we've set up smart energy services business to help customers decarbonize their businesses through electrification. And we're about to start a joint venture with a company now on home retrofitting. So I suppose early days for putting in place, I suppose, the foundational and the building blocks. And of course, the other piece of this, electrification doesn't make sense unless you have the renewable power at the other end. So Ireland is currently 40% electricity from wind generation, moving to 70%, as I said, from 2030. So I suppose the next decade, the next half a decade in particular, are going to see a huge upsurge in uptake of electric vehicles and driving towards electrification. Big engagement, of course, is necessary with consumers and with the political system and with stakeholders. And one of the things that I think utilities have as our stock of trade in this, we have huge trust with our customers, and we have a huge interest in doing the right thing for customers and communities. And I think that's the one, I suppose, defining characteristic of all electricity companies.
Thank you, Pat. Sounds like you're off to a really strong start there. I don't think you're at the early stages, but it sounds of it. I think you're really on the right path. And Christian, maybe we can go to you, because I know Norway is a leader in the world on electrification, and a lot of countries are looking to Norway for leadership and advice. So maybe you can give us a sense of where Norway is at this point in time, and what the gap is to go, I guess, to get there. I think you're on mute, Christian.
Thanks. Yes, personally, I drive a fully electric car, and I also have a plug-in hybrid as well as the second car. And I have been flying a fully battery electric plane. In Norway, we already have more than all new cars. Half of all new cars sold last year were fully electric. And the target is to only sell battery electric cars from 2025 onwards, only 4 years from now. So fossil cars would not be sold in Norway 4 years from now. We are also electrifying the ferries, the passenger and car ferries. We have many fjords in Norway. So next year we will already have reached 1/3 of all passenger ferries will be either fully electric or driven by hydrogen, so non-emitting. The airports will be prepared to receive electric planes from 2025. They will be small planes in the beginning, but the target is that by 2040, all domestic travel in Norway should be emission-free, hydrogen or electric. Further, we have a big industry in Norway in metal, and we are working hard to replace the coal used there, to take oxygen out of the metal and replace that with hydrogen. Norway is fully committed to non-emitting, no emissions in 2050. And we are also a large oil and gas producer. So we are taking away the emissions from that oil and gas production by electrifying the installations in the North Sea. But of course, there is still carbon in the oil itself. But that has to be taken away by the countries consuming it. So we believe in the future there will be a massive drop in the demand for oil and gas from Norway and all other producers. And we are preparing ourselves for a fully renewable future after the oil and gas. But there will be a long transition time, of course.
Thank you, Christian. Maybe, Heather, we can go to you and give us a sense of what's happening in Ontario.
Sure. That's very impressive leadership from Norway. That's certainly something to strive for on the electric vehicle front. So, I mean, in Ontario, I guess what I could say about Ontario that is quite impressive, or that's quite a good starting place, is our electricity system. So our electricity grid is incredibly clean. So went through an exercise, kind of culminating in 2014. It took a decade-long process, closing off coal, 9,000 megawatts of coal off the system, which really left us with an incredibly clean and resilient grid made up, largely of nuclear, very strong hydro assets, renewables, and the like, really giving us a clean system, 90% GHG free. So, we're starting from a great place in terms of our electricity system in Ontario, very clean, strong grid. But unfortunately, electricity right now only accounts for about 15% of final energy use when you're looking at it from that perspective. With the vast majority of the bulk remaining around 80% still of the energy coming from fossil fuels. So I guess the best you could say there is some uneven progress in terms of our state of economy-wide electrification. The transportation sector is making great strides, and I think as you look across the economy at the different buckets, transportation is certainly considered low-hanging fruit, and there's tremendous opportunity around transportation. So OPG, Ontario Power Generation, the company I work for, has been focused on building out a business around that, looking at EV charging, looking at electrification of mass transit and things like that, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more as we have the conversation. I guess what I would offer up, though, or sort of suggest here, is as you talk to the folks on this panel, I think it'll be incredibly important for these various sectors as they pursue the pathway to scaling up, is to really leverage the expertise of the electric utilities. And these various sectors, whether they be transportation, industrial processes, heating, they're not in the business of managing electricity and the complexities around that. They're in the business of managing ridership if you're in transportation, or managing industrial processes. And so really, I think leveraging the utility sector, the electricity sector, will be a key part of that pathway to broader electrification success.
Thank you, Heather. And Pedro, over to you. I know California obviously has been a leader in North America in terms of moving forward with renewable power, and maybe you can give us a sense of where things are in California right now.
Thanks, Barry, and great being on here with all of the panelists. California has set some pretty aggressive targets early on. So we have law on the books that says that the state will reduce its emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, 40% from 1990 levels by 2030, which is 9 years from now, and will be net zero carbon by 2045. So that's about 5 years ahead of the Paris Accord targets. As we look at what that will take for the state for our Southern California Edison utility, we've looked statewide though, and see that pathway to 2045 means a lot of things you've heard from our fellow panelists here. It means significant increases in renewable energy, adding something like 80 gigawatts of central station renewables, along with 30 gigawatts of distributed energy storage resources, adding 30 gigawatts of bulk power storage, and 10 gigawatts of distributed storage, 30 gigawatts of solar earlier, and using all that clean energy to electrify a lot of the economy. And so that's where the nexus to this panel comes in. That's a massive move for the economy in California. That means that by 2045, you're electrifying 3/4 of passenger vehicles on the road. You're electrifying 70% of building space and water heating. The 2030 waypoint on the way there is really aggressive. Of that 70% of buildings needed to be electrified by 2045, we'll need something like 1/3 of them to be electrified by 2030. On the passenger vehicle side, 7.5 million electric vehicles on the roads, we think, by 2030, compared to 20-some million by 2045. So it's a massive move for the economy, requires significant investment. I think we're making some headway. If you look at the state right now, across the U.S., there are about 1.8 million electric vehicles registered. 800,000 of those electric vehicles are in California. And so there's significant leadership, but it's the early baby steps. And so there's so much more work needed in the years ahead. 9 years to 2030 is a very short period of time. Even the time to 2045 is a short period of time. And it's a time period where, to get to 2045, we see the need to add something like $250 billion in investment statewide just for the bulk power level renewables and storage resources and the associated grid improvements needed. That doesn't include the investment needed by individual customers in changing out their electric vehicle or installing a heat pump or the like. So this will require significant public-private partnerships, with utilities playing a key role in, first and foremost, bolstering our grids, but also playing a key role in working with customers to educate, to help have programs, to help bring in incentives, and to help ease the transition. Final thought, Barry, is that our company also has Edison Energy, which operates serving commercial and industrial customers nationally and internationally. And it's interesting to watch a transition through their lens, because they're all in very different jurisdictions across the globe. You're seeing different path in terms of government regulations and mandates, but a common thread across all of those. And right now we serve something like 15 out of the Fortune 50. Common thread is that these corporate clients, regardless of the jurisdiction they're sitting in, are seeing the transformative value of renewables and storage, not only from a sustainability perspective, but from an economics perspective and a resiliency perspective too.
Thanks, Pedro. So that was a great, I think, summary of for all four of you about where each of your jurisdictions is currently. And it's just such an exciting time for our sector to see the possibilities of what's ahead of us and the amount of investment and effort that's going to be required to make the progress that's necessary. So I guess I want to move to that area in terms of what are we looking for in terms of policies and market signals. I would say what's necessary for us to achieve these goals. We know we have to build significant amounts of infrastructure, whether it be transmission, renewables, charging, those kind of things. But what are each of your jurisdictions really looking for to accelerate this move into electrifying the transportation, the economy in general? And what are you asking from government, from regulators to allow this to move forward? And we'll mix this up a little bit. Maybe we'll start this one with you, Christian, and you can give us a sense of what it sounds like. You got tremendous support in Norway. But are you looking for additional measures from the government, from regulators to allow you to move faster at this point in time? You're on mute, Christian.
This transition cannot be done by single companies or customers only. There needs to be regulations. First, the most important, I think, is to have a price on carbon emissions, the CO2 price, for which Europe has a system in which Norway is participating. And the ideal situation is that the large economies of the world goes together in one united system, hopefully starting with Europe and US and China. If that is happening, I think the rest of the world will follow, like we have seen previously in getting rid of lead in gasoline or ozone hurting chemistry and so on. So we need CO2 price. Also, we need regulations. For instance, in the most scenic fjords in Norway, you will not be allowed to enter in with a ship that is emitting pollution from fossil fuels. So a few years from now. So then all the cruise liners in the world know that they will have to run on other fuels in those situations. And those areas can be expanded. So you have to start somewhere like the World Heritage Fjords in Norway, and then it will be gradually expanded. And it has to be predictable, and it has to be announced several years ahead so that the industry can change and engine systems and so on. So the most important tools for the world to change is partly the whole, should I say, customer-driven aspect that we just all spoke about. The need to do, the wish to do it, the motivation, but then we need the CO2 price as a hard driver, and we need regulations as a hard driver as well. I may comment on one of the questions, if I'm allowed, on the electric planes. I can see in the chat. Is that okay?
Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, just the range now is about 100 kilometers. Then you have another 60% of safety margin, like planes should have. I think in the future it's likely that it will be a combination of, it will be fully electric, but that electricity will be coming from batteries at takeoff. But during cruising speed, it could be hydrogen that it converted into electricity on the plane in a fuel cell, because hydrogen is much more lightweight to store than batteries. So it could be for planes. Probably the best solution is a combination of hydrogen and battery electric. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Maybe Heather, will go to you and give us a sense of what you're looking for in Ontario to really start accelerating electrification.
I'm gonna go on a limb here and say, I'm not really waiting for anything. So I think we have before us really what the imperative is around climate change, and granted, different jurisdictions have different goals and different milestones. I guess in Canada, more broadly, we could probably all align around the need to be net zero in the 2050 timeframe. So I think we have our goalpost and what we need to reach. And unquestionably, that is going to require broader electrification of a whole variety of sectors: transportation, industrial processes, heating, and it's going to require, I mean, I guess a little bit of what you'd call all hands on deck, all technologies, obviously not emitting technologies, but all technologies, nuclear, hydro. It's going to require, I think someone in the chat offered up, I had a question about hydrogen. I think that's going to be an incredibly important part of the solution within the transportation sector and electrifying transportation, fuel cells, but also industrial processes and other things. So I think we have our broader policy before us. I guess I would think sort of beyond that, if you think also where we are as a continent in terms of COVID and economic recovery and the things that we're going to be needing to do as we climb out of the pandemic, hopefully in the incoming months. There's a huge opportunity to link economic recovery policies, I think, with a climate change imperative, and that will help spur the electrification that I hope we will all see, and that will spur federal investment, provincial investment, local investment, and then the private investment will ensue. So I think we got to start with the end goal in mind, which I think we all know is around the 2050 need to be net zero, at least in Canada, and then we can go from there.
Thanks, Heather. And Pedro, maybe you can comment on this.
Yeah, happy to. And from our perspective, where we sit in California, we need policy help from the federal, the state, and the local levels and different attributes. And maybe it's helpful to start with the punchline. The benefits here aren't just decarbonizing. When we did our analysis, what we also found was that largely because electric technologies are so much more efficient than conventional fossil fuel technologies, less from a physics perspective, less energy in for the workout when you're moving around with electric motors instead of a combustion engine, for example. Because of that, the average customer in California will spend 30% less of their wallet on energy across all forms in 2045 than they do today. That's powerful, right? Because from a policymaker perspective, yes, there are some significant investments that need to be made and a dramatic shift in the economy, largely through electrification, but to the hydrogen question, hydrogen will play a role for hard to electrify segments of the economy. And we're happy that EPRI, for example, is working with the Gas Technology Institute on the low carbon resource initiative to explore that side of the equation. But because of that cost reduction, there's value to be had that can then be allocated in order to help drive some of the incentives and support that's needed now. So from a federal perspective, we now have an administration that has endorsed Paris, that's looking at developing the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. A lot of dialogue right now about what that means, and I saw a question in the chat about, what does it mean for the power sector? President Biden has talked about policy to have the power sector go to zero by 2035. We're engaged in the dialogue on that. We need policy support in terms of developing the technologies that will help accelerate the power sector's decarbonization. But at the same time, we need to make sure that those policies are mindful of affordability and of reliability, and just frankly, the pace, a realistic pace for technology deployment. So one other policy support that we need is making sure that as the federal government and state government takes a look at decarbonization policy, that they look at optimizing that across the entire economy, not just in any given sector alone. And so, I think a simple-minded way for me to think about it is that taking out the very last CO2 molecule from the power sector will be, that last molecule will be very expensive to remove. If you spend those dollars instead taking out molecules in other economic sectors, you spend that dollar electrifying a vehicle or putting in a heat pump, you'll actually get more CO2 molecules out than you might have by taking out the last CO2 molecule in the power sector. So making sure that policy is engaging in that cross-sector dialogue is really important. Really quickly, other policy areas, where support's needed. There will be a need for incentives, for tax incentives, for example, at the federal level, research and development support. We think that we'll need at least triple the current federal funding levels for R&D on zero carbon fuels and storage technologies and grid modernization. And then at the state and local levels, not only do we need what California has been doing already, but there's a heavy lift to be done in terms of aligning and coordinating planning processes, having a common view on load forecasts, on what resources can be built, and importantly, on how do you build resources. And the transmission planning and development process in particular is one that is going to be one of the linchpins here. It requires a lot of support to make sure that we can build transmission lines faster than the current 10-year development cycle.
Thank you, Pedro. Christian, I know you had your hand up, but I think we'll go to Pat and I'll come back to you, okay? Pat, go ahead.
Thank you, Barry. I suppose, look, a lot of this has been covered already, but stop subsidizing fossil fuels and moving to creating the incentives for renewables and for electrification. I kind of think that this is almost a perfect coming together of policy, industry, and citizens. That's what needs to happen here to make this happen. The role of regulators is important. In Ireland, we've significant opportunity in offshore wind off the west coast of Ireland. So that would be the fuel of choice beyond 2030 to take us in Ireland from 2030 to 2050. So putting in place the arrangements to make the investment frameworks to make that happen. Permitting, whether Pedro talked about permitting for transmission, just permitting full stop is really, really important. And that requires a dialogue with citizens about the greater good, because some people are going to be impacted by permitting and by new infrastructure. I noticed something there in the chat about efficiency, and I suppose in the European hierarchy, it's decarbonization, energy efficiency, and electrification. And I think energy efficiency and electrification go hand in hand, particularly with the ordinary residential consumer. So how are we going to convince residential customers to make choices that are going to require them to invest significantly in upgrading the efficiency of their homes in order then to take on a heat pump and become more carbon efficient and more energy efficient and more carbon neutral? So again, incentives and tax breaks for customers to help consumers with the choices that they have to make, because the choices are more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative. And I believe that utilities have an important role to play in that. Christian talked about carbon. I think a price of carbon is absolutely essential. I'd go so far as saying that a price of carbon at the point of end consumption is the ideal in this, and something like a carbon border adjustment tax is because we need to incentivize human behavior, and there has to be a direct link between the choices people make and the carbon that they consume and the price of that. So there's a lot, as I said, it's a perfect coming together of policy, the industry, because the industry can make it happen, and consumers.
Thanks, Pat. Christian, you had a comment?
Yes, two comments. First, on economy. There is a transition cost here. We are going to rebuild the system, but once it's done, which will take some decades, but when it is done, we will basically extract energy from the sun and the wind and the rain. So the fuel will be for free, basically. And it's more or less all capital costs. So the lower the interest rates are, the lower this transition cost will be. So we are preparing for a world with a very efficient and very low cost system after the transition. When it comes to making the most economical steps first, that will be an automatic effect of CO2 price being the same in all sectors. Then we will have exactly the effect that Pedro is asking for, namely that we societies are looking for the cheapest options in this transition. So, and there's a second effect of a CO2 price is that ultimately these CO2 prices that has to be paid goes to societies. So it's a way of financing all other activities. And in fact, the tax system that most countries have in the world today was designed 100 years ago, at the time when labor was scarce and nobody cared about emissions. So we are taxing people's work the highest and emissions the lowest. And we need to tax emissions high, because that is a problem now. But it will have the effect of creating a lot of funding that is needed for all type of activities in society at the same time. So the CO2 price is not only important in its own right, it's also important to have a fair transition.
Thank you, Christian. So we just talked a lot about customers over the last couple of questions, and sort of the benefits of electrification and engaging with our customers. As we all know, the industry, the electricity industry, hasn't been that good in explaining the value of electricity. And we all know that our entertainment and communication bills are more than our electricity bills, but electricity seems to get much more attention than your cell phone bill or your internet bill. So now what we're talking about is, really having electricity being a bigger part of everything that we do going forward. So there seems to be a massive communication exercise that has to happen by the industry to really explain the value of electrification. And because as Christian said, at some point your bills may go up initially, but over the long haul would definitely come down. And when you look at the total amount that's coming out of someone's pocket to pay for energy, it will come down if you electrify. So I guess my question really is, how do we engage with our customers and stakeholders in a better way to explain these benefits of electrification? Because it does seem like historically we just haven't been able to crack that issue well. And because electricity is very valuable even today, for the price that is being charged for it, the benefits that society are getting from it is tremendously valuable. So I think we have to be better as we do more investment in the sector and more interactions with our customers. We have to find a better way of explaining the value of that. So maybe a comment on that. And I'll start with you, Heather, in terms of some of the innovative things that maybe OPG is considering. I know that you're not maybe same as a distribution utility, but maybe you can offer some thoughts on that.
No. I mean, despite that, I mean, we consider every ratepayer in our jurisdiction to be one of our customers. So, I mean, I think you're right. How do you communicate to customers about this? I think they would all probably either be completely confused or bored stiff if we were to go through long lessons of how this all works and all the things that we need and the various mechanics of it. And I know historically, there are challenges in certain jurisdictions, certainly in Ontario, which has a very complex electricity system, of trying to sort of explain how the system works. We've made it about as complicated as you possibly can. And so I think the way we are going to, and we are communicating with customers and the ratepayers in Ontario is through our climate change plan. So late last year, we announced our climate change plan, first ever climate change plan, with a couple fairly ambitious goals. The first one to be a net zero company by 2040. And then the other one to broadly support, decarbonization of the economy by 2050, sort of lining up with the broader goal. And so a key and incredibly important part of that climate change plan and of us reaching that goal is our electrification of other parts of the economy. So, I mean, our assets in Ontario, I think I'm going to build off a little bit what Pedro said. 90% GHG free in Ontario. We have a wedge of gas assets in Ontario, which provide fairly important resiliency to the grid, are really necessary to be there when you need it for peaking capacity and all the things that we know and understand are important from that little wedge. Our efforts are much, much better spent taking that grid that is 90% GHG free and powering the other sectors. And so I think the conversation we're trying to have is sort of around that climate change imperative and how important it is to take that clean electricity that we've all invested in significantly to build out in Ontario, has not been without pains. And now we put it into the other sectors, and that's where the electrification part plays in. So And that will be to their benefit too. That's the other part. It's a little odd, but it's sort of, a huge amount of fixed costs are built up in that system. And if you spread it over more users, that just is a numerator, denominator type equation. It's a more efficient use of the electricity system, and benefits should accrue to the ratepayer. But it's really that climate change imperative that is how we're communicating around the work we're doing.
Thanks, Heather. Pedro?
Yeah, Heather, I thought you provided great perspectives there. I think I would add, from our company's perspective, we think about the communication with the customer at least a couple different levels. There's a very high-level communication that's probably more focused on general public, policymakers, et cetera, around the broad benefits. And that's where the investment we've made in our Pathway 2045 work, some of the work I cited earlier, really plays to that, to being able to have a point of view around what will it take to decarbonize our state's entire economy. What are the implications for the power sector and for our customers? And I saw in the chat somebody was asking for details on that. So if you go to our website, you'll see our Pathway 2045 materials there. But the punchline is that was a 30% reduction in the average customer's total energy bill by 2045, and it does include some of the underlying energy investments needed. So that's one level. Another level, though, very tactical. It's individual programs, right? And so if you go to our utilities website at SCE.com, you'll see there's educational information there about how you switch out into an electric vehicle, and there's a cost comparison calculator, and information on our charge ready programs, whether you are an end use consumer, retail consumer, or a school or a business. Information also on the building electrification side, right? How do you think about changing to a heat pump, and how do you think about the costs and the issues around that? So a couple of very different levels. One other angle I'll add is we don't just communicate alone. We communicate as an industry, and this is an EEI meeting, so I'm going to shamelessly plug EEI and Power by Association, and the example of the work that we're doing on the task force that I'm co-chairing on electric transportation. There the industry has come together to develop common practices to help streamline the customer experience. And so we're providing best practices, if you will, to share with our members across EEI. We're also working as an industry group to engage particularly with the large commercial customers, the fleet operators, the automakers themselves, the charging companies, because we all need to collaborate to not only bring the technologies to market, but to make sure that the customers who are going to use them are well educated about them and are going to adopt them. These are beneficial to them. So important collaboration as an industry.
And Christian.
Yeah, in addition to the pure costs that everybody is occupied with, like comparing how much does it cost to drive your car electric versus petrol. In Norway, that's about a fifth of the cost if you use electricity. But that's important. But I think the biggest value to human beings, to each of us, is that it's the cheapest way to simply avoid a climate catastrophe. So the value of living in a world that we want it to be is the biggest value. We need to be better on climate communication, not in a negative way that we are painting a gloomy picture of the future, but we need to communicate that this is simply needed in order to avoid it. If there's still so much ice in the South Pole and Greenland and the other glacier areas in the world, including Norway, that if it is all melting, the sea level in the world is going 70 meters up. 10% melt is 7 meters sea level increase. We can just imagine how the world would be. So to avoid these type of things is the biggest value of it all.
Thank you, Christian. Pat?
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, I suppose I think we've allowed our industry to become taken for granted, and I'd like to think that the last 12 months of COVID pandemic have put electricity in the power sector much more center stage. The societies that we have and the economies that we have today across the globe have all been enabled by electricity, and electrification is a great opportunity, if you like, for a second coming of our industry. That's what we've done for the last 100 years, and the next 100 years, it's a great opportunity. But I suppose too, we need to think about what's the emotional connection we have with customers. What business are we in? We're not in the business of selling kilowatt hours, and we just think about it like that. We're in the business of selling comfort and convenience. It's what people do with the kilowatt hours that matter, and so engaging with our customers around that and what electricity does for them I think is something that we have to be better at. We need to be good at embracing customers and applying design thinking to what do customers actually need. We're doing a project in a small rural community in the southwest of Ireland to look at how the enabling technologies interact with the distribution system. So heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar panels, battery storage, smart meters, and how the distribution system and the customer and the enabling technologies all come together. And what we found is that there are people who really want to embrace the technology for the reason that Christian outlined, because it leads to an overall better world. I think we need to find those people, and those people then become advocates in their own communities. And it's very, very interesting what we found. But of course, as engineers, we're well capable of making this very, very complicated, because we'll try to build the perfect system where we will buy power back from somebody's electric vehicle battery. It's about keeping it simple for the customer, giving the value to the customer, but also that emotional connection with the customer about what the product called electricity can actually do for a decarbonized planet.
Thank you, Pat. We're going to move on to sort of industrial electrification. It's sort of seen as a bit of a tougher challenge. Not that all the things that we've just talked about are not challenging. They are. Maybe get a comment from each of you of how you're addressing, the transition of industrial customers to electricity from conventional fuels, and what kind of engagement you're having, what ideas you're using, and some success stories that you've had in each of your jurisdictions. And I'll start with Pedro. Pedro, maybe you can comment.
Sure. I'll comment from both the perspectives of SCE and Edison Energy. At the utility, we do what I think a lot of our utility peers do, lots of work through our business customer division and engaging directly with larger commercial and industrial customers. And here, when you think about the technologies involved, they're so valuable because it's not only about decarbonizing and not only about the economics, to add to Christian's earlier point, but when you look at electrification, it also plays a significant role in improving air quality. That's certainly true with industrial technologies. I'll also go beyond the question and say it's very true, particularly when you think about transportation electrification. And there's a nexus there for a lot of the industrial customers, their use of heavy-duty transportation, or when you think about a port, which I would kind of put into that large customer category. We have the Port of Long Beach within our territory, and they are our customer. We also have the Port of Los Angeles next door, served by Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And both of those ports are seeing the benefits of electrifying a lot of the gantry operations and the heavy-duty transport in and out. So that has an impact in terms of air quality for the surrounding community. That is a great adder here, because that's a co-pollutant that needs to be dealt with just as much as greenhouse gases. And frankly, that goes towards helping make this a more equitable transition, one that's addressing the needs of all of those low-income, disadvantaged communities of color that are in that corridor that has a lot of industrial production and transportation out of the ports. Quickly, outside of the utility, Edison Energy, I mentioned already, and for them, it's really helping those customers understand the potential value, not only in terms of industrial processes, but in terms of the underlying economics and sustainability characteristics, using electrification technologies in their processes. Finally, that's another shameless plug now for EPRI. I'm glad that so many of us are members of EPRI, because it is providing great support to the industrial customer base and understanding the technologies available to reform the processes.
And Christian, maybe we'll go to you. I know you mentioned earlier about the work you're doing to electrify the oil and gas extraction process and making that as clean as possible. Maybe you can comment on some of the things that your company is doing to really get at that sort of industrial electrification matter.
Thanks. Yes, I think perhaps the most important work we do is that we actually are selling clean electricity, renewable electricity that is certified. So we have a system where we can document hour by hour that it's produced in a clean way and sold to specific customers. And there are more and more customers wanting this guarantees of origin, so they can prove to themselves and to their customers that they have a clean supply chain. And for instance, we are supplying all Daimler factories of cars in Germany with that type of electricity now, so that not only the car itself is running on clean fuel, but the production of the car is done with clean electricity. In addition to that, we already mentioned the metal industry, where we are working hard to replace carbon with hydrogen, which I think is important. We also have a very interesting project with Yara, who is a fertilizer producer based in Norway. And they use natural gas to supply the hydrogen needed into that process. We will replace it with electrolyzers to produce hydrogen from water. And that goes into the fertilizer fuel, and then we will have green fertilizers. The main problem or challenge here is to sell the product. It is more expensive to have fertilizers made from clean hydrogen than from fossil-based hydrogen, where the CO2 is just sent straight up to the air as a byproduct. If you compare a bread at the shop, if the whole supply chain to that bread is fully clean, based on green fertilizers and green transportation, it's just a very small percentage of increase to the customer. You don't even notice when you buy the bread. But to those farmers and in the supply chain, it's a big challenge to get those costs placed. So again, I think it's the commercial setup, the way it's customer prefer to buy the products, and governments are asking that the supply chain need to be clean, that will drive the change. It will not happen only if the customer like it, because it's difficult to put it into industrial scale. So in most cases, we have the technology already today by a combination of electricity storage, hydrogen and other purposes, but it's how do we distribute these extra costs in the supply chain that is the challenge.
Thank you, Christian. Pat?
Yeah. So we've an industrial energy services business, and we've done some work with large industrial heat pumps in the food, dairy, and some pharma industries. This is hard yards. This is a tough sector to electrify, and I think ultimately hydrogen will have to be looked at here as if you go back to that hierarchy I spoke about decarbonization, efficiency, electrification. First of all, the easy to reach electrification, and then the more difficult one, and industrial electrification is the more difficult one. So hydrogen as a premium fuel in this has huge potential, and I suppose with a cheap, abundant, renewable electricity, as the cost of offshore renewable electricity generation fall, then the production of hydrogen from cheap green hydrogen from cheap offshore wind energy then it becomes a storable fuel, and it becomes a transportable fuel. And we already have a hydrogen transport infrastructure in the form of ammonia today. So I think hydrogen ultimately, I think, is the piece that we have to look for here. Round trip efficiency is poor today. Cost of hydrogen production is high, but in time we should see efficiencies and costs fall. But key to this and key to green hydrogen is going to be an abundance of cheap renewable electricity generation from renewable sources.
Thank you, Pat. Christian, we'll come back to you in a second. Let's just get Heather's comments on this.
Sure. I mean, I actually think both Christian and Pat have kind of nailed it already. I don't need to repeat sort of where we stand, but I mean, suffice to say, we continue to look in Ontario at ways to electrify large industrials. As I said, bring them in almost as a part of an economic development platform, load growth platform to help provide cost-effective, clean, reliable electricity to the industrials. And as I said, it puts downward pressure on your electricity rates when you're able to do that. But on the hydrogen piece, OPG has put a significant amount of time recently into looking closely at hydrogen, not only in the transportation sector and what that could mean, say, to long-haul trucking or even rail, but how can we cleanly produce hydrogen for industrial processes? So again, just as I think Christian and Pat mentioned, sort of, we're talking about green hydrogen through electrolysis, and the primary driver of the cost of that being the electricity piece. So how can we get that industry down the road to scale where it is cost effective? So I agree.
Christian, did you have something?
Two additional comments on hydrogen. First, if we are to transport hydrogen from where it is produced to where it is consumed, it's a lot of that transport will happen in the form of ammonia, which is a liquid under light pressure, a few bars, and it can be more or less handled like a normal fuel as we know it today. So I think that could solve a bit of what we use gas for today, like in peak plants and so on. And the other comment is on hydrogen. What we talk about is called green hydrogen in Europe, the electrolysis way of producing it. We have something else called blue hydrogen, which is made from natural gas with capture and storage of the CO2. And that's likely to be part of the picture as well, although in the long run, I think smaller than green. But in Norway, we have a huge project to store that CO2 from that type of hydrogen production in the bottom of the North Sea in old gas fields. So probably in the future, we need to capture some CO2 as well and store it. But the big picture is still electrification and to produce that electricity in a clean way.
Thank you, Christian. Since this is the Global Electrification Forum, I think I'll take a question from the attendees, and it's a political question, maybe not. And the question really is around how do sort of the Western world, I guess you call it, Canada, America, Europe, really try to move forward, China, Russia, India, other countries along the same path that our countries have been on, to honor the Paris Accord and really go to that sort of 2-degree scenario, net zero. What do we need to do to really encourage that to happen with these other nations in the world? Maybe Pedro, I'm going to start with you, and you're a deep thinker on some of this stuff, so I appreciate your comments. We only have about 5 minutes to go here, so.
I'll give you a very quick take on that one. I don't know how deep the thinking is, but look, there's a lot of high-level diplomacy that's involved there. It's probably beyond the scope of what most of us do in our day-to-day activities. But I do think that what we can really do is demonstrate the viability of the transition. So every piece of work that each of us does around demonstrating that you can run the grid with more renewables, that you can deploy more storage, that you can use energy efficiency to help decrease the overall need, that you can electrify a lot of the economy, that you can use clean green hydrogen where it's harder to electrify. Those demonstrations and then sharing that technology on the global stage, creating demand that helps then encourage manufacturers to go up their own learning curve to bring the cost down. I mean, when I think about the early days of renewables, California was certainly at the forefront. Places like Germany and Japan and Spain were too. There were some bumps along the road, but the reality is some policy choices and hard work by companies in our sector created demand that allowed the cost curve to go down from 15 cents per kilowatt hour to under 3 cents per kilowatt hour today for large scale solar. So that's something that we can and must do, and we must share.
Thank you, Pedro. So lead by example is really, I think, a message there. Christian.
I would take the chance of trying to align a few of the big economies of the world, Europe, US, and China, maybe India. And then I think these new technologies will be so efficient, and we can also have a carbon border tax to the other economies in the world, and it would drive the whole development. We have seen it in other examples, like I mentioned, lead-free gasoline and so on. If leading nations go first, the rest will follow. So we shouldn't have the ambition to have the whole world running as one line here. We should align the big economies and get moving first.
Okay, Pat, any comments?
Yeah, look, just very quickly, I think that a sufficiently, a sufficient number of, I suppose, economies coming together. I think carbon price, carbon border adjustment, and I think using trade and the carbon component in trade to drive behaviors is, I'm only a utility executive. I'm not a politician, but I think there's something here around levelizing all of this through carbon, because ultimately what it's all about, it's about removing carbon.
Thank you. Heather, any thoughts?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you're right. This is a diplomacy discussion that far exceeds sort of things that I would grapple with on a day in, day out basis. But I agree with the trade levers and the carbon piece. That's going to be a big driver. But going back to the first point, I think of sort of demonstrating successes in other jurisdictions and making things seem attractive. I mean, if you think about China and India and these economies, they're massive economies where their ability to do things at scale, well, certainly outpaces Canada, I will say. And so in many ways that will make some of these things that much quicker to find economic outcomes that are positive, I would think. So that could be an added draw once we depict how these things can unfold successfully to implement theirs. They certainly have an ability to do things at scale.
Thanks, Heather. So folks, I think we're going to wrap it up there. We just have a couple of minutes left, so there's not enough time to go through another round of questions. I just want to thank you today for participating. I want to thank EEI again for organizing the event. I think we all realize that we're involved in such an exciting transition for the world at this point, and we're working in an industry that's front and center in that transition, and we're all fortunate to be doing that, frankly, because there are other industries that are being impacted by the things that we are doing, and we do have to remember that. And it has to be a transition, really. We have to make sure that we are aware of the impacts of what we do on these other industries as well. So I want to thank you again, and look forward to seeing you in person at sometime soon post-pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you again to all of our panelists for such an insightful conversation. I think you all touched on the role of not only the electric companies and the energy industry, but of customers, policymakers, and regulators in achieving electrification and decarbonization goals.